Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by Kendall Wood. Kendall, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I know that we just kind of connected off Instagram, so it's cool to actually be talking face to face.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the amazing thing about technology, right? And there's so many blunders to wellness, you could argue, especially when we talk about social media and stuff, but to connect on similar wavelengths with people that are into supporting our culture, right? And supporting wellness and health. That's what we're talking about today. And just going to jump into it. Kendall Wood, and you specialize in yoga for first responders.
Yes, I do. And that's been quite a journey in getting here. I really started yoga for my own mental health and mental well-being back in the day in my early 20s after finishing college and just kind of not knowing what my next steps were. Found myself in a place where I felt a little bit lost, unsure where to go next, was working 3 jobs at the same time and just feeling totally burnt out. And a friend invited me to a yoga class. And after taking that class, I remember leaving the yoga studio feeling more calm than I had in years. And so something really hit me of like, oh, yoga isn't just a workout. It's not just about fitness. It's also about like feeling good in our minds. It really has led me down an interesting wellness journey. When I became a yoga teacher myself, I wanted to teach to people like first responders or veterans who really can benefit from yoga from the mental health aspect, maybe even more so than the physical aspects of the practice.
Well, awesome. Thank you for the really quick intro. I'm curious what kind of jobs you're into or what you grew up thinking that you wanted to do.
The funny thing is that so I've had so many ideas. I'm a pretty creative person and I like variety. So I used to want to do something more creative. I thought I wanted to be an interior designer. Then I thought I wanted to work in event planning. I did work in the hospitality industry for a while. I went to college for communications and public relations and worked in event planning and did marketing for restaurants and event spaces, actually when I was living in Seattle. But the interesting thing is that when I was 17, I actually told my parents that I wanted to move to San Diego and become a yoga instructor, but they told me no and that I had to go to college. So
Yeah.
I kind of did that. And then funny enough, years later, I ended up moving to California, moving to San Diego and becoming a yoga instructor.
Yeah, life finds a way, or maybe purpose finds a way in life, and however you want to dissect that. But no, that's super cool. I think that depending on when this episode drops, we haven't had anyone directly speak on yoga, or yours might air at a very similar time to someone else talking about yoga. But for the listeners that aren't super close with me, yoga is not something I practice, which is exactly why we need to be talking about it on here. And so that's me admitting my own lack of confidence and competence in something. I like to share that in the vein of yoga, my cursory introduction to yoga was hearing some benefits, and finally in my adulthood in this job was like, man, I could probably afford to be more flexible or more mobile, right? So speaking on those super limited terminologies, right? Like, because you're going to talk about how much more it is than like flexibility or even mobility, right? And so all these other practices and breath work and all this stuff. But I put on some like free yoga thing, on demand. And I was like, okay, I'm going to walk through this and challenge myself. And, fitness and wellness is all dimensions. And my wife, that was my girlfriend or fiance at the time, like walked in. She's like, what are you doing? And I thought she was literally just like, oh, why are you doing yoga? But she was literally saying like, what pose is that supposed to be? And it doesn't look anything like what's on the screen. So I share that just to say that it's extremely hard. So for those that are like, oh, I want to do something hard. It is very hard. So much to the point that I don't practice it. And so that's my own admission. And I appreciate you coming on so you can educate me and everyone else about why it was so significant for you and all the benefits therein.
Totally. I love that you bring that up. And it sounds like you got a little bit made fun of the first couple times you did yoga. So
yeah, it was playful. Yeah.
For sure. There's definitely that experience, like when you're learning any new skill, right? Whether it's yoga or whether it's learning a new fitness routine or training for something on the job for the first time, there's going to be like a little bit of awkwardness at the beginning. So I like to just remind people of that with yoga. Like, even if you're not flexible or you don't know the names of the poses, like be patient with yourself, give yourself time, it'll all come. But the interesting thing is that like, so yoga originated like thousands of years ago in ancient India. Back then, yoga was actually, it was only practiced by men. Initially, like in some places and some research shows that women were not allowed to practice yoga.
Mm,
And it was for warriors. It was for preparing for battle. It was kind of like a form of martial art. And it's interesting because now we look at modern day America where we think that yoga is for like housewives and really flexible ballerina type women. But
mm-hmm.
that wasn't the initial implications of yoga. It was actually used to like prepare your body and mind for battle. So I think that's an interesting thing for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with yoga or don't know that history to look into that, because there's some quotes like somebody says like yoga is a martial art you do against yourself. And I
Mm.
think that's so true. That's why sometimes it is like kind of challenging and difficult and you're twisting yourself in these weird pretzel uncomfortable positions, but you're at the same time learning how to breathe and learning how to stay calm when you're in discomfort. And that translates so well to work as law enforcement officers or firefighters, where you have to be able to stay calm in those uncomfortable positions or scenarios.
That's such a good stereotype that you brought up. That is very much a thing, right? Like we hear yoga and we think feminine, we think about who practices it and what they're wearing and the colorful athleisure and all these like archetypes. Or you go this like kind of woo woo, I guess, dimension. But yeah, that's cool that you bring up like the history of being rooted in warrior culture. And it makes me think of Street Fighter and Dalsim. Are you familiar?
I'm not.
Oh, the old, okay, so old fighting game, and which is a
Oh,
terrible
okay. I know
caricature
what
in
you're talking
itself.
about
Yeah.
now.
It's not helpful that he's like the worst character, and someone's gonna try to fight me on it, but they're wrong. He's super slow and stretchy and just weird. But anyway, no, that's a great nod to like the history and then also recognizing some of the impressions that are associated there.
Yeah, I like to dispel some of those like common misconceptions of yoga so that people realize that yoga really is for everybody. It doesn't matter what your physical capabilities are or how old you are or if you have an injury or not. Like, there are things that everyone can pull away from this practice, and I hope that like in our conversation today I can leave the listeners with some tools that you can take away and utilize on your own time to help with mental health, resiliency, as well as like the physical side of it too, building strength and mobility and improving your posture. So much that yoga has to offer. Obviously, I'm a big advocate for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say it was life changing for you. I mean, you went to one session and then look at you now. It's like your career. It's your life. It's your lifestyle. Super cool that it's hit you on all these ways. I'm curious. So when you got into yoga so much that you were going to be an instructor, what led you to decide, yeah, first responders, military, fire personnel, like that's where I want to apply myself?
The thing that I noticed when I first started teaching yoga, like as a brand new yoga teacher, usually the first place you get hired is at like a gym, right? Like a gym environment. One of the first place I worked was at a climbing gym in San Diego. Even at some of the yoga studios, there's a huge fitness component to the practice. People are there because they want to like burn calories or lose weight or learn how to do a handstand, which are all like
Mm-hmm.
totally okay goals. But I started getting kind of burnt out of hearing people like come up to me after class and ask like, how many calories do you think I burned today? Or
Mm,
when do you think I'll be able to do the splits? And I kind of was like, whoa, like let's back up for a second. Like that's not why we're coming to our yoga mat. Let's kind of detach from some of those really physically rooted and like kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Just like societal pressures, like to lose
yeah.
weight or to be able to do something like you see on the cover of a yoga magazine.
Yeah, like I might throw out the word like superficial, right? Like it's literally on
Sure.
the exterior, right? What we see.
Sure. Yeah. And I started getting kind of like, oh, like I don't want to teach yoga for just for like fitness and have people feel like they need to like have their Apple Watch on and look at exactly how many calories they're burning the whole
Mm-hmm.
session. I want to, because yoga helped me so much with my mental health. And like when I first started practicing, I had super unhealthy coping mechanisms. Like I was working really late nights in the hospitality industry. I was drinking. I was living on Capitol Hill in Seattle at the time. I know you
Mm-hmm.
were in Kent. So,
That was
you know,
that
yeah.
was a fun town, and now it's a little different.
Yeah,
but
yeah, it was back in.
I think it's got hope.
Yeah, I hope so. I did enjoy my years living on Capitol Hill, like 2013 to 2015 or something. And I left right when it started to get really expensive and really like overrun, and it changed.
Yeah. Well, you
But
say overrun. Yeah. Like you left way before the Chaz or the Chop, as people may have seen in the news or saw locally.
yeah, but I loved my time there, but I was definitely in like the nightlife scene and staying out really late and then just sleeping in as late as possible until I had to go back to work, and I wasn't exercising or eating well back then. So when I started practicing yoga, and not only was I practicing yoga, but I was also starting to live a bit more mindfully and have more respect for my body and what I was putting into it and how I was nourishing myself. So long story short, I used to struggle with panic attacks. I stopped having panic attacks. I started sleeping better. Those were the things that really stood out to me as big changes. Like, sure, I was feeling more physically fit and healthy, but the fact that there's a loud car outside, but the fact that I wasn't having panic attacks anymore and I was starting to sleep through the night better, those were the big things that I wanted to pass along to my students as a teacher. I started looking into places where I could do that. And I did a training with this organization called Connected Warriors that provides yoga for military and veterans, and started working with them. And I really loved that. And then at the same time, I met my now husband, who was a firefighter. And I started realizing, like, okay, if yoga is beneficial for these veterans that are in their 60s and 70s with severe post traumatic stress symptoms, why not teach it to people like my boyfriend and his friends who are in their 20s and at the beginning of their careers?
Mm.
And I found some really interesting research that there was even one study that found that people who had a consistent meditation practice were less likely to develop post traumatic stress symptoms in the long run because they were more able to process their thoughts and emotions through mindfulness. And I found that super interesting. So then I started to kind of branch out and talk to some fire captains we know, and talk to some other first responder groups. And over the last 5 or 6 years now, the rest is history. I work with CAL FIRE now. I work at the CAL FIRE Training Center and teach yoga as part of their firefighter academy, and do some work with other first responder groups around Southern California and even outside of California in other states sometimes too.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love that recognition that in practice you figured out what was most validating, what you wanted to seek out, and then to see the efficacy in the military and the veteran communities translating to first responder world, which we in the community recognize a lot of the carryover of stress and post-traumatic stress and all the different health, let's say, hurdles and issues. So to see yoga combat a lot of those things is fantastic, right? We talk about stress and anxiety and sleep and all these things that are intertwined. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. And it's been really cool to see the difference that it's made for people too, and how it actually has been well received. Because I will be honest, especially 6 years ago, I'm trying to do my age in reverse, but I was like 26 or 27, and going into fire department and working with like crusty old fire chiefs and trying to get them to do yoga. I was like, how am I going to come in here as a young woman yoga teacher and get these guys to take me seriously? And that was super intimidating at first.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I remember there was like one in particular, this like old Cal Fire chief who's just kind of grumpy old, that you probably
Yeah.
know the type, just like the grumpy old
Yeah.
guys.
And
And
they're not fighting words because these guys would probably self-define that way.
totally, totally. They're like proud to be
Yeah.
grumpy old crusty guys. And he came to my class. I taught at it was like a Cal Fire chief training, and they were required to go through a yoga class. So they had to do it. And he kind of showed up late, and there was only one mat left, and it was in the very front.
Oh
So
yeah,
he had
front and
to
center.
come.
Yeah, love it.
He had to come up front and center, and he was grumbling and kind of annoyed by it. And then over the course of the week we did 3 sessions, and at the end of the third session he came up to me and he was like, hey, like, I was talking to my wife over dinner last night, and we actually would really like to start going to yoga together. Can you recommend some studios to check
Mm.
out? And I was like, yes, I got him. Like, it's cool to see when somebody can be really skeptical at first and be like, wow, okay, I actually feel good in my body. I know I'm doing something to take care of myself. And maybe this isn't just like a cheesy woo woo thing. And it actually has some like tangible benefits.
That's awesome. What helped you overcome that, let's say, confidence with a crowd that you're not accustomed to, or a crowd that you anticipate would be pretty standoffish, which sounds like you had a couple people that were exhibiting that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, for me, it was almost like a feeling of like, I don't know if I belong here. For me, it really came down to, first of all, just working on my own self-confidence, like really trusting that I have a important thing to share that can be helpful. And then just really honing in my teaching style to focus on like how can I bring benefit to these people's lives and show them that there's a benefit here. So it was really just building up my own self confidence, being able to walk in the room and hold my head high and just speak with with eye contact and all that stuff. And it's been really well received overall,
Nice.
and I don't think yoga is for everybody. I want to also make that clear. Like, some people aren't going to like it, and that's okay. So I think the other element of that, when you're dealing with a group of people that might not like you or might have some preconceived notion about you in any situation, is just to detach from the need to please everybody,
Hmm.
to go into it saying like, you know what, the people who need this are going to hear it and going to be receptive, and the people who don't like me, that's okay, they can just space out and ignore me, and that's okay, and not to take it personally.
Going back a little bit, it sounds like you basically leaned into your purpose and knowing why you're there, and that you had something of value that could be received well by the right people, and just to know that. And the reason why I asked you that, and the reason why I kind of want to refocus on that, is because so many people that are going to be listening in are really into wellness. They're really into self-development or team development. And so we're talking about culture change. And for Kendall to recognize that she felt uncomfortable, like, I want to use you as an example because a lot of us feel uncomfortable talking about this stuff, right? A lot of us feel uncomfortable talking about normalizing mental health care. We feel uncomfortable about talking about working out as a group because people get uncomfortable with that, right? Like, then it becomes egos, and I don't want to be embarrassed, or I don't want to be bad at something visibly in front of others. So it's just trying to challenge and invite everyone to surrender the ego, just recognize like that there's something for everyone and something that we can get better at, whether it's yoga or any other modality, or finding the little things that resonate with you, right? So maybe it's really not the physical practice of yoga. Maybe it is, well, I say like the physical, but maybe it's not like the specific movement or muscle challenge, because there is that. Maybe it's more of the mobility. Maybe it's more of the breath work. Maybe it's just shutting down your brain and doing something and focusing, right? That mindfulness you're talking about. So I love that aspect. And even the point where you're talking about how yoga might not be for everyone, or Kendall might not be for everyone, like, that's okay. And we can translate that to different things. We know that's a thing in anything, right? So what is weightlifting? Like, there's so many types, right? There's CrossFit, there's strength training, there's like hypertrophy, traditional weightlifting, there's kettlebells, and like only kettlebells, and don't do anything but kettlebells, right? So there's every little niche, but it doesn't mean you have to abandon the whole thing just because you don't really love one aspect. So with the conversation of yoga, like, it's such a short word, like a 4-letter word, but it can mean so many things. Like, is there a specific type of yoga that you prefer, or is there a classification or a genre that you go by, or that you to present to people?
First off, with that, I like to say that any yoga is better than no yoga.
Any yoga?
I think so. But also
That's a big statement.
it has to be specific to the person, because everyone's going to have their personal preferences. Just like some people like CrossFit and other people want to do, like, I don't weight lift. So I don't know. That's a hard analogy for me. I'm like, I don't know, like Olympic weightlifting or
Yeah,
like
exactly.
whatever,
Exactly. Yeah.
or just like body weight exercises. Like, everyone's going to have their thing that they like. So finding the thing that you like and taking the time to hone in on that is important, versus just going to one yoga class and hating it and then thinking that you hate yoga. Maybe try a few different studios or different styles or different teachers even, because even within the same style, two different teachers could have a totally different vibe.
Mm-hmm.
But as for what I do, after doing my regular yoga teacher training, once I started working with first responders, I decided to go on and become trained as a yoga therapist. And yoga therapy is like the yoga therapy program is basically like a master's degree in yoga. It's like a 3-year program, something like 1,000 hours of training. And it goes more into the therapeutic benefits of the practice. With that training, I love working with people one-on-one or in small groups where I can really hone into their specific needs. So when I teach with, let's say I have like 5 different clients, I'm going to teach a slightly different way to each of them because maybe there's one person who's already a weightlifter and is super strong, but doesn't have very much mobility. And what that person might need is just long holds on like deep stretches,
Mm-hmm.
okay, or like dynamic movement. Then I might have another client who's like an 80-year-old woman who has like low bone density and doesn't have good balance. And with her, I'm doing more like stability work and working on balance and strength. So that's like 2 extreme differences. But there's a lot of subtle things that are different too. Or maybe somebody's recovering from a shoulder injury, and then somebody else feels physically fit but isn't sleeping and wants to focus more on breath work or meditation practices to help with sleep. Thanks to my yoga therapy training, I have a pretty wide range of knowledge, and then I can hone in with individual clients or groups on what might be best or most helpful for them.
Yeah, as you describe that, and I guess even the phrase yoga therapy, it sounds very synonymous with types of physical therapy, right? You're describing ailments and prescribing a specific movement or a specific modality to try to help someone through their unique issues or their unique circumstances.
100%. Yeah. It's almost like building a protocol for healing, and that could include yoga poses. It could include meditations or breathing practices. It could even include lifestyle modifications or things like massage or foam rolling, right? So there's kind of a wide spectrum. And I like that yoga therapy bridges a gap between physical therapy and talk therapy and yoga, because I also get a chance to really like sit with my clients and talk to them and get to know them. And we talk about life and their stress levels. And there's that open communication element too, where I'm not a traditional therapist, but I think just like human to human, being able to listen to each other and support each other is really valuable, kind of like peer support, right? Just being able
Mm-hmm.
to have somebody that can listen to you in a non-judgmental way can be really helpful.
And I'm curious, is there commonly a crossover into, you say yoga therapy, but is there ever a crossover of practitioners or people that are clinicians in a mental health capacity?
Yeah, definitely. And that's actually something that I'm planning to start a master's program in psychology this year
Oh,
so that I
cool.
can cross over into that a little bit more too. Just because the mental health side of it is such a passion of mine that there's a lot I can do within yoga therapy, but I would like to be able to help even more in that realm. But
Hmm.
in my yoga therapy training, there were people who worked as medical professionals or psychologists that are also taking that training to implement in their practices.
That's cool. And not to say you wouldn't have earned trust. And I think that anyone that's worked directly closely with someone, either professionally or as a coach or some kind of component, right? If you're working with someone individually on nutrition or you're a personal trainer, I think that most people could attest that they have put on that kind of therapy hat, right? Because it is that human connection. You're with people in their pretty intimate moments, right? Like, and that's in discomfort, like physical exhaustion. You're spending so much time with them, and so you end up naturally talking about the day, and that's fantastic. I just wanted to, just for my own understanding, and then for the listeners to, so that they knew, okay, like we're not necessarily talking about like therapy, but then also like that is a potential. Like you can find that person, and in some short amount of time, moderate amount of time, Kendall will be that person, right? So that's pretty sweet that you can hit it from multiple angles.
For sure. And sometimes, like, even as I'm planning to do this master's program, sometimes I also feel like there's some benefits in not being a clinician sometimes because the person knows that you're not going to like diagnose them or pathologize them or
Mm,
tell them that they have a certain condition. Like, I don't diagnose or treat specific mental illnesses. So I break it down into like more of like, what's the symptom? Are you not sleeping? Is your back hurting, right? Do you feel anxious often? But I'm not going to give them a diagnosis, which sometimes can be nice. And I actually really like that. And that's probably the thing that's hardest for me as going into this master's program and potentially becoming a therapist in the next few years. Like, giving people a diagnosis seems like it carries a lot of weight and it makes me a little nervous.
Yeah, for sure. And from I guess the user or the client, if you want to call it that or call them that, I suppose it creates that enhanced safe environment, right? Where, yeah, I don't want to be labeled. I'm just connecting with a person. And no doubt that when you're working with someone and you're helping them with their physical pain and discomfort potentially, and you're helping them with some mental adversity and, some emotional support either through direct practice like breath work helping their anxiety or talking just a normal thing like an organic conversation with someone that cares, like that's really great to have that and then not have to worry about these other layers.
For sure. And that's also something that I guess I just want to say is unique to each individual, because I think for some people, receiving a diagnosis can be really helpful and it can make them feel like, oh, I have this diagnosis. That's why I am the way I am. And now this makes more sense to me. And that can be super beneficial for some people. And then other people don't want to have that label. They just want to look at more of like the smaller moving pieces and see what can play out in the long run too. So I just want to like say that so that anyone who's listening knows that like whether they're in one camp or the other, their feelings are valid.
Yeah, no, that's such a thing. And I feel like a lot of people think it's a cop out, but it's not. It's like just inclusive and recognizing of like the multifaceted nature of the world and life itself. Like you can't paint things with a broad stroke, or you can. We see it done often. We shouldn't, right? So just to that point, the time that this airs, there will be a relatively recent episode with Dan Zaya Joseph, and he got his master's in psychology, and he's a veteran, and so he found that by giving his troops, by giving his peers vocabulary, it helped them understand, right, different elements of post-traumatic stress by putting a name to it. At the same time, like you're absolutely correct, like that could be counterproductive towards people, and every individual is different. It's a great theme, right? Because you're literally talking about how different instructors could be completely different and the energy they bring in, right? Like think about like hot yoga and just like this really intense thing. And then we can recognize that there's a lot more calm types of yoga practice, right? So I think that a good theme that I like to highlight is don't just oversimplify or categorize things and write it off, right? I frequently say, hey, just because you talk to a clinician, a counselor, or therapist otherwise, and it didn't work well at that time, don't write it off. That was a different time in your life. Circumstances are different. That person is very different. You're a different person. Like, think about looking at someone else or trying someone else. So, if people that are yoga averse and still listening, then maybe that's an opportunity, right? Like you can see and continue to listen to what Kendall's about. And then maybe that'll take me right into a question I want to ask is if people are listening, they're like, okay, I'm going to take tongues challenge and I'm going to get uncomfortable. I'm going to lean into that. And this is an area where I'm entertaining that. Like, where would you have folks start as far as either looking at something or if they want the low hanging fruit and to go online, like how would people navigate how to even dive in and try to find some things to try on?
There are so many
Yeah.
resources. It's definitely overwhelming. I will, of course, plug myself. Call me, I will help you. I find that I love working with beginners, especially like even just doing a couple sessions one on one with somebody like me. Even if it's not me, I will forgive you. But doing a couple one on one sessions can help people understand some of the basics, some of how their alignment should be in poses, how to breathe, how to modify for their current injuries or health conditions. And then if they go online and watch YouTube videos, they have a bit more of that groundwork to fall back on. Kind of like going back to your story of trying to do a YouTube class and your alignment is all wonky and
Oh, I couldn't even see it. Like yeah, for sure. So like, the living room isn't like a gym or like a studio with like wall mirrors, but even then I probably wouldn't even know, right? And to firm out that story a little bit, like my wife came up and she started kind of manipulating my body. She's like, "No, you're okay, so see how your arms are? Like you really need to stretch them out, like get your hands up higher and then move this foot back." And then I was, as anyone could probably imagine, like I'm about to fall over at every little like manipulation or movement just
Mhm.
to really underline how I was not up to snuff there.
Yeah, and having a teacher or somebody to guide you through that the first few times can help build people's confidence to then show up at a public yoga class and walk into a room and know that they can go through a yoga sequence and know some of the names of the poses and keep up with the rest of the class without feeling so lost. So I think for beginners, even like just like with weightlifting or something, it's really helpful to hire a coach when you're new, get someone to help you with some of the alignment and some of the basics, and then go to the YouTube videos and online resources. Just because I think I see a lot of people starting with that, and you can build some bad habits at first. I will say one of my favorite free resources is an app called Insight Timer, and it's a meditation app. So that's more focused on mindfulness practices, breathing practices, and meditations. But that is an excellent resource, and they have teachers from all around the world and a ton of content that you can listen to for free. I like it because they screen everything that's on there, and it's a little bit more specific than YouTube is. So I think you get higher quality content on Insight Timer versus on YouTube. And the app also has a built in timer where you can just set a timer and choose a background noise if you want music or white noise in the background, and just meditate in silence for a set amount of time with your preferred background noises, which is nice if you're a little bit more advanced. But that's my favorite. And I think that that app goes under the radar a lot. A lot of people know like Calm, and there's another really popular one. I forget the name right now, but there's a few other really popular meditation apps, and I really prefer Insight Timer. So I like to just give them a plug. And they also, versus like some of the apps where they just have one or two voices that you can listen to, Insight Timer has a ton of different voices and different teachers. So you can really hone in on what you like.
Very cool. So you kind of brought it up or paid a little nod to this, but what are some things for you that are pet peeves in yoga instructors, whether they're instructors that you've seen, or maybe it's like an influencer or something, maybe things that we should, as lay people, run for the hills and look for someone else?
So, one of the biggest things that I don't like is like the spiritual bypassing, or like too woo woo, where they're just like love and light and positive
Hmm.
energy. And like it gets a little bit cheesy. And especially in like the first responder world, is just not going to be taken seriously. Like find somebody who can handle talking about trauma, talking about grief, talking about loss, like someone who can like handle the full range of human emotions, because that's a really important element of yoga, is that like welcoming of emotions, sitting with discomfort, sitting with pain. And teachers who don't acknowledge that, to kind of push those things aside and just focus on just like happiness, feeling good, love and light, that is a huge pet peeve of mine. So that's one thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I love that you talk about that because there is a stereotype there, right? Of painting that picture where everything's fine, right? Everything's awesome. And sometimes it's not. And so, especially when you talk about the applications to first responder and military, I think that's so valuable to not, shy away from that. It almost, when you describe it a certain way, it feels like a mask, right? And we don't want to shield and hide things. We want to process them and metabolize them in healthy ways. You brought up alcohol earlier, and I appreciate you sharing that. And for sure, like, it was a very unhealthy part of my lifestyle. And I just want to take a moment to say, like, just the fact that it became the go-to hangout, like, it became like a version of a coping mechanism for sure. Like, I remember certain stints of a shift where it was just normal for me to come back home and drink one or two beers and then have like a bowl of cereal, which is like totally like a college, like post-college thing, which was post-college for me. But like, that's not a good lifestyle. And I'm not knocking people for moderate alcohol use. Like, I still used alcohol. I say use, and I think that's probably helpful to use the word that way, moderately, right? But so differently. Like, I thought I was a social drinker back then, but I would call myself a social drinker now with much less. Again, not to cast judgment, but I think it's just part of the conversation I want to continue to socialize, especially with first responders, that it doesn't have to be a normal thing, and it shouldn't be like a super normal thing, because it's not helping us. And we should consider how it might not be aiding us in the ways we want, and also paying attention to the consequences and negative side effects of that.
That kind of goes into one of the foundational elements of a yoga practice, is building self-awareness. I think when we build up our self-awareness and ability to self-reflect, we can notice where some of our habits are leaning into the territory of being unhealthy or harmful for us, versus being just like a balanced, moderate consumption thing. And alcohol is definitely one of those. So, and I kind of want to go back really quick for a second when we're talking about self-awareness, to that like allowing yourself to have feelings, because I think it's a really important part of the work I do, and why I like to work with first responder groups is that there is so much of what I hear from law enforcement officers, firefighters, even like my sister is an ICU nurse. So we look at the healthcare professionals too.
Yeah.
We see people in jobs like yours see so much trauma and so many intense scenarios, but it becomes so normalized. And it's just like another day at work or another day at the hospital or, another call. Research is really showing that if we close ourselves off to feeling the painful or difficult emotions, we are closing ourselves off from feeling all emotions.
Hmm.
Where if we don't allow ourselves to grieve or feel sad or feel like that sense of like a little bit of humanity for the people we're interacting with, we also stop experiencing as much happiness or joy or connection with our loved ones. And so when we're able to find places like maybe on your yoga mat or your meditation cushion where you can just sit with and acknowledge and maybe sort through some of the scenarios you saw that week, or sit with like, oh, you know what? I am actually feeling really sad about that person who I saw die a couple months ago. And that sucked. And like, let yourself feel that and breathe through it and have a way to say like, yeah, that really sucked, but also it's over. I'm breathing now, but I also am feeling that, and that's okay. And being able to shift between that is really beneficial to our health and longevity in the long run. I think that if we hold too much in, it just kind of creates a volcano that's going to erupt eventually as like stress or anger or something difficult. And even though you might feel like you have to stay strong when you're on the job, and that's probably what's going to keep you safe on the job, you got to stay like with it, focused. Carving out some time in your week or month to let yourself feel is a really important part of healing, in my opinion.
Hmm.
I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love a lot of where you went. Well, I love all of it, but I'm trying to remember different factors. So one, I mean, you say like research informs us that that's not good, and we can all think about either personally times where the compassion fatigue, right? So like all the ups and downs and the hardship and the trauma just makes you kind of numb, right? Like we know these concepts that luckily is being taught more in academy, but we need to be reminded of it, and we know examples of those that came before us, not to judge, but just to recognize like a different culture that talked less about it. Hopefully we can be more about it to avoid those things, right? So we've seen and heard those cursory tales. At the same time, like hopefully by building up momentum, we're paving the way for not only ourselves, but the generations after. Hopefully they make it even easier, right? Like the barrier of entry is even lower for all these conversations, recognition, and practices to be better. There's a notion, and I've talked about this in a recent episode, that compartmentalizing is helpful, and it is for the purpose of the job, right? In operations, like I can't roll up on a collision where a kid's really injured. If I am true to that moment, I'm going to break down, right? I'm going to think about my kid. I'm going to think about all these other kids. I'm going to think about the family and how hard, like how long are they going to be in the hospital and all these things. I can't, right? I have to focus on the job at hand. And so we do become stoic faced and we become seemingly insensitive. But yeah, if you bottle that up, then you are essentially allowing that to condition you in this calloused way, right? Like literally, that's, this callous like developing over your emotions. So yeah, I love the aspect where you suggest there has to be a time and a place to unpack that, to be true to your feelings. And luckily, we're getting better about recognizing the notion of like diffusing. Fire is traditionally a lot better at this than we are in police, because part of the nature of the job is like after a call, they return back to the station. And so it's a little bit more natural to break bread, to put a hand on the shoulder, say like, man, that sucked. And I like to share that on the peer support notion, not just for peer support people, but like the culture of peer support, where just saying, man, that sucked, or drop a couple F-bombs and just acknowledge that, it gives other people permission to share in that acknowledgement. And usually for me, just someone saying, yeah, that really sucked, or a version of that, like F-bomb, whatever, it really empowers me to be like, okay, cool. Like I'm not alone, and I feel, and it's normal for this feeling to be such because we're sharing in that feeling. But also I like the aspect that more agencies are recognizing the power of an app, right? Like socializing and standardizing or suggesting, through some version of training, like, hey, bust out this app and do some breathing, right? We learn about box breathing, or most of us do, combat breathing, Grossman calls it. So whatever prescription of breath work is just like forcing us to breathe more and get more oxygen through us, right? To de-stress. Like that's great. There's even kind of these quiet rooms that are popping up that I'd love to have something like that in our future at my agency, where it's just a comfy chair, maybe a massage chair. You can kind of zen out, turn the radio off, and then your supervisor or your buddies responsible for tapping you, if something big pops up. But otherwise, like 10 minutes, right? 15 minutes, it's going to pay dividends on your longevity, like career wise, but also you're recharging. So yeah, I love all that. So those are a lot of the thoughts that popped into mind when you're talking about these things. And when you said like sometime later in the month, like that might not be ideal, but man, it's better than nothing. Even if it's like you're meeting up with your buddy, like maybe it's an old battle buddy, or it's just your really close friend before police work where you connect and you talk about life and you unpack some things, and it's a safe venue for you to feel and to emote. Like that's huge.
100%. Yeah. And I think the thing that stood out to me most of what you just said was this really important distinction between the fire and law enforcement world is that most police officers are driving around alone in their cars or maybe with one partner versus the firefighters have a group of 5 to 10 other people around them all day long. So yeah, you have all your meals together, you work out together, you have that ability to go back and just sit on the recliners and talk about the day. But with law enforcement officers, you're kind of on your own a lot. And when you're off work, you're not going back to the station and having a sleepover with the boys. Like you're just driving home and trying to switch gears to be with your family. So I
Yeah.
think that's a really important distinction to be mindful of and to notice if, for people listening that are in that role, to notice if you're continuing that and kind of isolating yourself and becoming isolated and feeling isolated. How can you cultivate community when you're off the clock or however, so that you do still have that connection and a group of people that are there to support you and to support each other?
Yeah, and the fire service, like it's just by design and by a different job. It's like a way different job, right? So when I talk to a peer that's over in the fireside with peer support and wellness, and he tells me that yeah, after a hard call, like the bat chief or whoever can tap a person and say, hey, you're out of service for the next 30 minutes or an hour. Like that's not going to impact operations to this level, right? It might cut into someone's break, and this is not I like making like fun of the fire dynamics, but it's just a different job, right? We can't do that in police as easily. But I also
Yeah,
don't like the victimhood and saying, "Hey, like our job's not cut out for that." Like let's challenge ourselves, right? As leaders, as people, as line officers, future supervisors, like how can we mimic or take or create opportunities for that, right? And so maybe it doesn't look exactly the same way. Let's recognize the challenges. It's hard to have like this little diffusing session when there's a gruesome scene. Like you can't pull everyone all together. Like they're blocking streets and some of them will be there for hours and some of them will go to the next call. And that's the thing. That doesn't mean we give up. That means we have to be intentional about later in the day or later in the shift, kind of getting everyone back together if we can, if for but a moment, and saying, hey, let's talk about that. Everyone good. And just that offering, I think, is huge. Or I've seen that where it might not be like people just talking about all this stuff, but the offering and the recognition can really help people just normalizing it, right? And it gets challenging too, with more officers working longer shifts. And I've talked about this before, if you have a take home car, then you shouldn't be totally decompressing on your way home. Like you're driving essentially a target and you might be flagged down to help a motorist in need, or you might be ambushed, or all these things, right? Like everything's possible until you truly get out of the uniform in the safety of your home. But it doesn't mean we can just ignore it. If that's not the time, then we need to find another time.
totally. I think that's such an important thing to talk about. And I'm curious, like, from your perspective, what are some other unique challenges that you face as a police officer when it comes to, these things? And some of the things that I've seen in the first responder, or then the police officers and law enforcement officers that I've worked with in yoga therapy, one of them is like a lot of back pain from the heavy weight,
Yep.
like the weight around your waist all day and just like posture and stuff, like physically uncomfortable. We're talking a bit about like the connection and community aspect, but I'm curious, like where else do you see challenges that are unique to your job that yoga can help with?
Yeah, I mean the physical ones, those are the first ones I would think of is the gear, right? The vests, and a lot of people have improved hip and back issues because they went to an external carrier. So for departments that don't have that, like keep beating the drum, and it's becoming more of a trend where people have the option, which is fantastic. But yeah, specifically to physiology, but you're sitting in the car so much, right? So even if you have an external carrier, like I did for a lot of my career, like you're sitting in there and your gun's on one side and then you might have other, like a taser the other way. So you're contorted in this unnatural way. Sitting in a car is unnatural, but then you're adding these other dynamics where you're twisting to the right to type on your car, like your car computer, and look at that. So there's definitely a lot with that. Yeah, when you started asking the question, where my mind actually went was just stress. And I think that there's a level of hypervigilance that I'm obviously biased, but I've heard it and read it in different sources where, the hypervigilance is to a different degree as a cop because you interact in the community. And even if you don't work in that city, like there's crossover to themes, right? You see crime or you see concerns and safety concerns around you, and you're expected to, and largely of yourself, you're expected to do something if stuff hits the fan, right? I don't think, and I know a couple firefighters really closely, some of my best friends. I don't hear this notion like on alert in case, something like they see smoke and they gotta like run in. Like there isn't really that to that level. So there's that. And then military, I've heard many veterans speak on, that's over there and this is here. And we know that that could be challenges therein, but especially with post-traumatic stress, but not to the level where they're in fatigues walking around at the grocery store and someone's going to attack them because they're in fatigues, right? Which happens with police. So I think that just that overwhelming hypervigilance and chronic stress in the job, and Gil Martin writes about how it takes so much time to kind of come down from that hypervigilance, which is usually not really enough time until someone's going to get back into their work week. So I say that all to say that, yeah, the focus on mindfulness practice, on breath work, on all these stress combating practices are so huge, right? Beyond the physical. So if yoga can offer that to people, like it's almost like if that's all they get, then that's like a myriad of value that they get.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that makes a lot of sense what you said about hypervigilance. That's something I've heard from other law enforcement officers too. And with firefighters, I mean, my husband's a firefighter, so I can make fun of them a little bit too. But even he'll say, like they just don't have as much without the fire engine. Like a fire could start across the street, but there's not a whole lot he can do to put it out without his
Mm-hmm.
gear and his SCBA and his fire hose. So there's not, it's harder. You can give someone CPR or something if they go down when you're at the grocery store or the airport or something, but they don't have their tools with them. They can't do as much. I feel like perhaps for police, they might feel a little bit more pressure to be there to support people in a wide variety of circumstances.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I've noticed that there's been times where something like a collision, right? Like at the moments that most people freeze, if they don't freeze, a lot of times they're looking at you. And sometimes I've felt that. And then I'm also like, hey, I'm still in observation mode. But yeah, you second guess yourself, you put pressure on yourself. So I'll speak for myself, but I know this is common with a lot of law enforcement officers. But it's like, where are you going to get involved and where are you going to draw the line? And I've said on many interviews, I don't carry all the time, like carry a weapon, but I say it so many times that I probably should clarify, like the large majority of the time I'm carrying because of that layer, right? Like I'm not the most amazing marksman or anything, but like I do feel like I've imagined the circumstance where something terrible happens. And if I don't have my firearm, like how ill prepared and how useless, right? Like how powerless, how useless I can feel that I could affect the situation a certain way. And that's huge. And I think that people carry that. I think we carry that. But then, yeah, like the different dimensions of what could happen, you're just so aware of it to this, I'll just say, unhealthy level, right? Because we have to be able to live life and we're not going to just avoid everything. But I remember I was in a training with a guy and he was a pretty new dad. And I believe I was too, because we were having quite a conversation about it. And he kind of just asked me, like, and it wasn't like peer support or wellness training or anything. He was just like, hey, let me ask you, like, do you have a hard time going into public places? And I thought he was kind of just speaking like generally. I was like, yeah, I mean, sometimes like crowds or whatever, right? Like these common things. I was like, like it does give me pause. And sometimes I don't prefer it depending on what it is or why. He's like, yeah, the other day, like I was at the mall and I was holding my kid in the carrier and it was like a baby. And he's like, I just felt myself like sweating. And then I just put my back to the wall and waited until my wife was done shopping. And like, I just like met this guy like out of town training. And I was kind of like, Yeah, that's a lot, man. And like, I would really think you should talk to somebody about that, right? There's a lot to unpack there. But just, not at all, like, I'm chuckling, but not at all to disparage him or judge him. But like, I'm glad he felt comfortable to say that, right? That's recognizing that in himself and sharing it with a relative stranger. But if anyone's listening and feels themselves even like a little inkling towards that, like, there's stuff to work on and work through, and nothing's wrong with you. It's kind of a normal response to this really abnormal stuff we do, which is basically like the crux of what we're talking about today, right? Like why Kendall's here is to apply this tool and this practice and lifestyle that's worked so well for her, and she's seen so much efficacy with so many people that have extreme stress and like lifestyle stress by nature of the vocation. And I said lifestyle. Yeah, I mean, truly, first responder world and military is a lifestyle. It permeates way past when you're on the clock.
Yeah, I think that story that you mentioned, like the guy standing against the wall at the mall, that is something I've heard from so many first responders and especially law enforcement. That feeling of just very aware of what could go wrong at any given moment, that sense of hypervigilance. And that's a really good leeway into something I really wanted to talk about today too, which is using yoga therapy as a nervous system regulation tool.
Mm.
And that is what can help combat that hypervigilance, regulating your nervous system and learning tools to self-regulate, whether it's breath work, mindfulness, repeating a phrase or a mantra in your mind, even just something simple as like, I am safe, looking around, really assessing the situation, realizing that there's no impending threat, and really acknowledging that, catching yourself when your mind starts to tell those stories or worry. Meditation is so, so helpful for that. That's really like my specialty as a yoga therapist, is teaching those nervous system regulation tools and relaxation techniques that can be so helpful to turn the dial down on that hypervigilance and let people feel like they can move through those more like normal day-to-day situations without having that like crippling anxiety or stress.
That's huge. Speaking for myself, and I recognize it in a lot of first responders, and the type of personalities and tenacity that comes in is like, usually we don't want to rest, right? Like we want to go harder and we want to go harder and we want to go 2 a days, and we lean towards these things like CrossFit, like combat sports, like powerlifting, because it's bring it, right? Like, even if I don't have anything in the tank, I'm gonna muster it up and drink a bunch of pre-workout, and like I'm gonna like mind over matter this. But really, it's such a backwards way to approach it, right? And like, or when we want to like recover, we want to recover harder, right? We think about like, oh, what tech or how many cold plunges can I do so I can do my 2 a days like crazy intense workouts? Like, well, maybe we should actually like backpedal, take a breath. I mean, pun intended. But also, I love how you highlight that, because it reminds me of this notion I want to connect with, which is this is all to like optimize your life and your ability to do your job, right? This is not woo. This is not just like because it feels good, like, which it might. Like, that's awesome. It feels good and it has efficacy in you doing your job and being able to process stress, which is really the name of the game, right? Physiological stress, nervous system, which is what you're talking about now. I mean, that's what everything is interconnected, and that's what is going to make you perform or not perform. And that goes into sleep and everything else. Like, I was trying to fix my sleep, which is pretty good now that I'm on days and I know some things. And I think a lot of it just came down to stress management. Weird. But yeah, just trying different herbal supplements and grounding, like standing outside, with my bare feet in the Pacific Northwest. And most of the year is not super comfortable, but like
Yeah.
the intention behind it could be good. I was trying to do that and then like throw a kettlebell around because I wanted to be like productive, right? Like, I hope most people are just like rolling their eyes and like, what an idiot, right? But I'll admit that like that was my personality. Like, I'll just get it harder, right? Like, I'll ground so hard and throw this kettlebell around in the rain, and then like that'll help me electromagnetic whatever to de-stress, and then it'll help my sleep. And no. Did you have more you wanted to cover on the nervous system regulation?
Yeah, I think what you just said is great. And I just want to also apologize for anyone listening because there's a helicopter that is outside my house. I don't know if you can hear it.
No, I
Hopefully
don't hear
not
it on
too
this end, but that car earlier didn't sound anything like a car, so I'm really curious what it sounds like on the recording.
Okay, well, hopefully it sounds okay. But you mentioned something really important, which is like even when you're trying to relax, you're trying to like relax as hard as you can. And that is still a sympathetic nervous system response. Like you're trying to relax in a way that still activates your stress response.
Mm-hmm.
Or you beat yourself up because you can't relax. And then you're in your head being like, oh, I should be able to relax. Why can't I relax? I'm thinking so much. And that's just activating more stress too. So really looking at that, if the people listening know that their tendency and thinking of what practices will actually tap into my parasympathetic nervous system response. One of my favorites is Yoga Nidra, which translates as yogic sleep.
I'm glad you
Some of
brought that up. I was going to ask you about it because yoga's in the name, and I posted about it on Instagram recently. So, yeah, please go ahead.
Yoga Nidra is one of my absolute favorite things. There's also I guess I would honestly call it a brand of Yoga Nidra called iRest that was kind of created by this guy named Richard Miller, who I actually trained with directly. And he took the more ancient practice of Yoga Nidra and made it more specific, kind of honed in on a specific technique that could be studied in clinical settings. So iRest has been used a ton in studies on veterans and military for stress and recovery. But Yoga Nidra is the overarching term that covers any form of guided deep relaxation practice. And Yoga Nidra helps your brain get into the parasympathetic mode and into an almost sleep state. For some people, they'll completely fall asleep. For others, they're kind of wavering on that, a little bit awake and aware, but also maybe drifting into some dreams or daydreams at the same time. And it's a really good brain state for recovery and for processing thoughts and emotions. So when it comes to carving out that time in your week or your month to self-reflect and take care of yourself, that's one of my absolute favorite things to tap into. There's a ton of recorded Yoga Nidra practices online. And it's also really good for helping people fall asleep. So let's say you get back from a really tough day on the job, or you just saw something that was really difficult to see, and your brain is still kind of spinning and thinking about the past, replaying that scenario. Yoga Nidra does a really good job of kind of getting you out of your head and back into your body. It usually incorporates a body scan of some sort, or a gentle breathing practice, or tapping into your senses, things that help you focus on what is present now rather than spiraling over worries about the future or replaying scenarios from the past. So that is something I really, really love. And I think if you don't know about it, you haven't tried it before, look it up and give it a go.
I love that we went there. I'm glad that you hit it. And what a great summary. You're the pro, but way better than I could describe it. What I'll add is that I've tried different guided meditations. Well, I've tried unguided meditations, and my active mind is kind of a mess in that, where oftentimes, like, just I have practiced mindfulness in doing something like yard work or just like going on a walk without device. Like, that's something I'm trying to get better at, as like this quote unquote moving meditation. Like, that works better for me in some ways, but just sitting, like the stereotypical meditation, like think about nothing. It's like not really think about nothing, but I have found that Yoga Nidra was really cool. Andrew Huberman, have you heard him speak on it?
Yeah.
But he breaks down really well. I feel like he's such a digestible presenter of such complicated material. He describes how it's very sleep-like as far as restorative. So you have sleep issues. That's where I actually got introduced to it. I can say that sitting down for like a 15-minute Yoga Nidra on Spotify, I felt like pretty recharged. And yeah, the body scan, I think that that's a great example, right? Where it asks you kind of just to go from like your toes up to your head and just kind of relax each muscle. I felt like that was really helpful. And to your point, like I've heard Yoga Nidra sometimes instruct, hey, don't fall asleep. That was cool. But at the same time, the ones that haven't said that, it has helped me fall asleep, when I was really stressed. Or think about it this way, like if you're laying there thinking about how you can't sleep, you may as well just try it, right? Put in some earbuds, and like worst case is like 10 minutes later, you're not sleeping. But there's more folks in the sleep industry that are like, hey, if you're just laying there not sleeping, like try to change something up, right? Don't do something like high stimulus, but like maybe read a paper book rather than like an e-reader with light, or journal, right? Like write down some of the thoughts that are bouncing around in your brain so that you can put them to rest. Like you wrote it down, right? So you can look at your list tomorrow and address it then. You can't do anything about it now constructively. So, no, thank you for dissecting that.
I love that you've tried it before and it's worked for you. And my meditation teacher taught me that if you fall asleep while you're meditating, it just means you need to sleep. So let yourself sleep and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
meditate again later. Or if your intention is to use Yoga Nidra to help you fall asleep, just let yourself fall asleep and the phone will turn off or the recording will end and you can just sleep through the rest of the night. And that's great. You mentioned that feeling of trying to sit and meditate and not think about anything at all. And that's another myth that I like to dispel, which
Mm-hmm.
is that meditation isn't about completely clearing out your thoughts. It's about bringing awareness to your thoughts. So even if the entire time you're sitting meditating, you're thinking about random things and your mind is jumping all over the place, as long as you can maintain awareness of that and have some curiosity for what's coming and going within your mind, you are still succeeding at meditating. And I think that takes the pressure off for some people. And if there are some moments where the mind feels totally clear, cool, enjoy those little moments of quiet. But for most of us, our minds are going to be busy, especially when we're new to meditating. So to just be patient with yourself if that's the case.
I'm glad you hit on that too. And because I didn't actually dispel that myth as I said that. But yeah, that was something that I thought. You feel guilty, right? You're like, just chill, don't think of anything. But it's like, I mean, that's like monk level. Maybe they can do that. But yeah, it's just to move on past it, right? Like let it come and go.
Yeah, thanks again so much for having me on today. I feel like this has been a really good conversation where we covered so much, from like the physical benefits and like pain relief benefits of yoga to these tools like yoga nidra and mindfulness that can help with sleep and recovery. Yeah, if people want to learn more about me or even potentially do a yoga therapy session with me, the best place to reach me is through my website, which is kendallanne.com, KENDALLANNE.com. I also work in conjunction with a nonprofit organization called the Iverson Foundation for Active Awareness. And they were an organization started by the wife of Corey Iverson, who is a CAL FIRE firefighter who died on the Thomas Fire in Ventura about 6 years ago. They offer yoga therapy sessions to first responders, oftentimes for free, so that you can work with me and they cover the costs of your first 6 to 12 sessions. So check my website. I offer that occasionally. Right now, it's January and it's available to take on new clients, but look into that as a resource too, because sometimes you can get yoga therapy sessions for free through that. And I also host different trainings at different first responder agencies all around the country. So if you like what you hear and you want me to come speak to your department or to your crew, reach out. I would love to work with you guys. That's the best place to contact me is probably through my website or through Instagram, which my Instagram is Kendall Ann Yoga. You can find me on YouTube and on that app, Insight Timer, if you want to try some guided practices with me there first.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Kendall. I appreciate you coming on.
Take care.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.